My name is Mike Mauceli, and this is the Energy Show with REI Energy, where we're energizing your investments and maximizing your tax deductions. Today, our guest is Marlo Lewis, Jr. Marlo is a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Marlo writes on global warming, energy policy, and public policy issues. And we're going to be discussing today why Americans reject EVs. And you're going to discover why Americans prefer gas-powered cars to EVs despite the massive government propaganda and tax subsidies. Well, Marlo, thank you for coming on the show today. I mean, I have been reading a lot, and our listeners have also been looking a lot at these electric vehicles. And I think the government is finally the government is finally starting to realize that the American population is really not interested in electric vehicles. Has this been just a big lie from the beginning?
Well, I think it's an ideologically driven hope or belief from the beginning. And of course, that's not the best basis on which to make investment decisions on behalf of an entire industry that serves a population of 330 million people.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think has been so unpopular with the American population, at least from friends of mine that I know, I mean, we just don't want to be forced into buying an electric vehicle.
Well, absolutely. And it's amazing the lengths to which they are prepared to go to force us, because, as you know, Congress last year passed this mischievously misnamed bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is just a gigantic spending bill, and federal spending increases inflation. And it's also a climate bill. And it provided all kinds of generous subsidies for the purchase of electric vehicles, up to $7,500 per vehicle, and all kinds of generous subsidies for electric vehicle charging infrastructure and for battery research. And yet the Environmental Protection Agency is not satisfied with offering consumers a subsidized choice. In other words, they're not content just to coerce taxpayers into subsidizing consumers. They are now also going to preclude consumers from exercising their freedom of choice in the marketplace. And so the EPA very recently proposed, this was back in May, proposed vehicle emission standards, greenhouse gas emission standards for passenger vehicles, which cannot be met even by the most fuel-efficient hybrids that are currently on the road. And I can give you the numbers, which I think are quite revealing if you would like me to do so.
Oh, please.
Okay. Well, if you, a lot of people may not be aware of this, but a greenhouse gas emission standard for a motor vehicle is almost entirely just a fuel economy standard by another name. And the reason for that is that the miles per gallon of a vehicle converts mathematically into the grams of carbon dioxide per mile of a vehicle. And that's because both miles per gallon or that's because the emissions of carbon dioxide are directly proportional to the fuel consumed per mile of the vehicle. So if you've set a fuel economy standard, you're regulating emissions. If you regulate emissions, you're regulating fuel economy. The EPA's number, it wants by 2032, by the model year 2032, for the average vehicle to emit only 73 grams of carbon dioxide per mile. Today's best performing Prius hybrid emits 155 grams per mile. So even if Toyota got rid of all of its non-hybrid vehicles and all of its vehicles met the standard of today's Prius, they wouldn't even come halfway to meeting the EPA's proposed standards. So how could Toyota or any other automaker meet the fleet average grams of carbon dioxide per mile standard. Well, the only way to do that is to sell more and more vehicles that don't have any emissions at all, more and more vehicles that don't run on gasoline or diesel at all. In other words, more and more electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles, or fuel cell vehicles. And it means that the automakers, to comply, will have to stop producing vehicles that most Americans still want because they like them for a number of reasons, one of which is their affordability. Another is, the fact that you can fill up your tank in minutes. You don't have to wait hours, to recharge and so on. They also have a longer range typically. And they want to exclude from us as consumers the right to make this choice for ourselves.
So isn't it that I guess the batteries in these these cars are very expensive, and I don't know what the life expectancy is on a electric vehicle battery, but wouldn't that kind of destroy the used car market? Because it's my understanding from some of the research that I've done that, these batteries only good for 8 or 9 years. So who's going to want to go out and spend the type of money to replace a battery in a used car? Is that not correct?
Well, yes. I mean, a typical electric vehicle can cost, up to $10,000 or $15,000 more than its non-electric counterparts. So it's the battery, as you point out, that is the biggest source of the higher cost. But they haven't been in widespread use long enough for us to know exactly how long we can count on those batteries to last. But from what I've read, a battery is not going to last the lifetime of the vehicle. You may have to replace your battery in 8 to 10 years. And then if you buy a used electric vehicle and it needs a new battery, all of a sudden you're spending pretty much what you'd have to spend to buy a new car. And already, you may know this, Mike, already the cost of the used car market prices are higher than they've ever been, and they've been climbing dramatically just over the last few years. And I think it is related to this obsession with vehicle electrification and pushing the fuel economy standards out as far as possible, which also adds to the technology cost of new vehicles. That's one of the reasons why people are buying more and more used cars, is because new cars, in many cities, people who are earning at the medium income, they can't afford a new car. The new car prices now, the average new car is something like $48,000. I mean, you got to be a wealthy person to afford a new car today.
And that's for a gas-powered car, right? Not an electric car.
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't really see how, the middle class or lower middle class is ever going to be able to afford these electric vehicles. And if it's anything like my like my telephone, my cell phone, that these batteries get weaker and weaker over time, so your charges don't last as long. I'm assuming that's the same thing that's going to happen with a lot of these electric vehicles. Over time, your battery is not going to hold the same charge.
Well, I would assume so, especially in the last couple of years of its life. And also you're probably familiar with this, that about 90% of all electric vehicle owners have at least one or two other non-electric vehicles. In other words, the typical EV purchaser is a well-to-do household, which is also a multi-vehicle household. But about 1/3 of America only owns a single vehicle. So what do these people do as their backup? A wealthy family can have one or two or more internal combustion engine vehicles as backup. If the EV has to go into the shop, or if the EV battery has to be replaced, or if they just need to drive in a situation where they need to be able to refuel quickly, or there may not be charging infrastructure readily available. So what does a single car household do when its only choice is an electric vehicle? And a lot of those single car households are lower income households. So there is an equity concern here, if you will, an environmental justice consideration.
Yeah, I think more and more, a lot of these policies that the government pushes, it's all about environmental. I know in my business, in the oil and gas industry, that at first they came after, the permitting process, but now I think I was reading one of your articles where the EPA is now kind of in charge of a lot of these environmental policies that are being pushed. And I mean, how is that possible?
Well, yes. I mean, at the very time that the EPA wants to require the production and sale of vehicles which are increasingly electric and which squeeze internal combustion engine vehicles out of the marketplace, they're also now proposing new standards for power plants. Which basically, once again, it's like the old Clean Power Plan that the Supreme Court vacated. It's only more aggressive. They're saying that that coal and natural gas power plants have to either install carbon capture and storage capable of capturing 90% of the emissions, or co-fire, as they put it, a natural gas power plant with hydrogen, not just any hydrogen, but low emitting hydrogen, which basically that's currently about only 5% of all the hydrogen that's produced now. And all the hydrogen that's produced now is nowhere near enough to power all the combustion turbines that currently use natural gas. So at the same time that they want to dramatically increase electricity demand by electrifying vehicles, and as you know, the environmental movement wants to electrify everything, buildings, right, appliances, right? So they want electric demand to go through the roof, but they want to kill off the most reliable sources of electricity that have been the workhorse of the U.S. economy for decades, coal and gas power plants.
So electric vehicles, I mean, I know they don't emit emissions, but in order to build an electric vehicle, I mean, you have to use equipment that runs off of diesel fuel. And so they're really not as green as everybody, proclaims, or the government proclaims, correct?
Oh, that's absolutely right. And I would refer your audience to a brilliant congressional testimony by Mark Mills of the Manhattan Institute from a few months ago. You can just look at the Manhattan Institute, and he's also written reports on this that his testimony was adapted from. But it's basically, nobody really knows whether you will actually reduce emissions on net from replacing your gasoline-powered car with an electric vehicle, because the batteries are made in China. China's main energy source is coal. A lot of the materials, the so-called energy transition minerals, are mined and processed in countries which are very fossil intensive. And so, at best, you begin to get a reduction in your vehicle emissions after maybe the first 2 years of driving an electric vehicle on average. But until that point, you may actually be contributing more emissions than you save. And then it also depends on how much you drive the vehicle. If you only drive the vehicle in order to go out on the town, on that special night with your best gal, well, then you may never reach that point where you're actually reducing emissions on net by driving an electric car.
Yeah, It doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, as far as, I mean, I understand that, electric vehicles and a lot of the, I guess, auto manufacturers, they're all now trying to get on board with producing electric vehicles, even though, it seems to me that the first items that probably should have been addressed would have been the grid on how we're going to electrify all of these electric vehicles that supposedly the government is now pushing on us. And but it seems like we just go after this backwards. I mean, as far as, let's build the vehicle first and then we'll worry about charging them later, right?
That's right. Well, the logic here is not the logic of engineering or economics, but it is the logic of politics. The electric utilities love these mandates, the vehicle mandates, because it means that their customer base will dramatically increase. And if they find that our permitting system is still so constraining that they can't increase the supply of electricity commensurate with the demand, then they can raise rates, and so they love that. And then similarly, the auto industry, it's more like they have kind of a Stockholm syndrome, or they've been made too many offers they can't refuse, because if they don't come along quietly, the California Air Resources Board can muss them up, but also they are being offered subsidies by the federal government, both directly, but also through these consumer subsidies for the purchase of these vehicles. And what's happening is then that the auto industry is being cartelized. In other words, a combination and restraint of trade, if it happens spontaneously in the marketplace, is declared to be an evil thing, and subject to antitrust. But if the government organizes it, well, then it's a climate solution. Yeah. All right. And so if all the automakers are going to be corralled into producing electric vehicles, then in a sense, the competition they face is dramatically reduced. No upstart can come along and say, well, you guys may want to go electric, but I think there's a segment of the market out there that still wants internal combustion engine vehicles because of their superior flexibility, range, and so on, and price, affordability. So we're going to manufacture those. No, now they don't have to face competition from upstarts in that way. And so it's highly collusive, even though I'm not saying that there's a formal or written plan. When this is a problem that sort of people of Marxist bent have in trying to understand these issues. They are all wannabe central planners, and they all assume that things cannot happen without some kind of central planning. But we know, for example, that a pencil is this miraculous, the simple thing like a pencil requires the spontaneous coordination of tens of thousands of actors across the globe to produce. And it's all done by price signals through the market. And so when you have an industry that's only got a handful of big producers, they all know what the incentives are that are coming from the government, and they can all make their plans accordingly. And they all know that it is in their interest as corporate incumbents to limit competition. And if the government can help them do it by imposing standards that preclude new upstart rivals, competitors, then unfortunately, most of them seem willing to go along to get along.
Right. Well, I know you have a lot of big companies now that are offshore wind companies, such as Shell. They had a big offshore wind project that they were putting together, and they've recently come out and said they're no longer going to move forward with that because they can't make at least a 6% return on their investment. And then you have other wind companies. I think there was one that went bankrupt, or one solar company that just went bankrupt, even though the government is trying to subsidize these companies. And now you have Ford, I guess it was earlier this year come out and say that they're going to lose $1 billion on their electric vehicle manufacturing this year. And then the government steps in and says, we're going to give a $7,500 subsidy. And all of a sudden, Ford raises the price of its electric vehicle by $7,500. I mean, it all just seems, it all just seems, that everyone's in on the take.
Yes, yes. But, the good news is that there isn't an unlimited power to sustain an economically unsustainable business plan or industrial policy plan, which is really what we're talking about here. And so, yeah, so you're going to find some of the rent seekers, losing their enthusiasm and maybe even peeling away. But it's very hard. I mean, most corporations are just terrified of the government. I'm venturing into now a topic that is really out of bounds for CEI. Not that someone's going to slap my wrist, but it's not really something that I can claim to have any expertise in as a policy analyst. But I think we all know that today, the government today is operating in a very thuggish way, and that if they want to get you, they've got the ways and means, and it's scary.
It is.
And I mean, and the most gentle side of it is the cancel culture, where you can be, canceled and deplatformed and vilified for holding the wrong opinions. And so corporations are timid creatures. Yeah. And so it really takes a lot of guts for a CEO to stand up to this and say, no, I'm not going to play this game anymore. So what it will require, what actually would help is if we had, a change of the guard in Washington, D.C., and we actually had a Congress and an executive that was dedicated to the rule of law and restoring genuine free market competition. Then I think you'd see more business leaders expressing what they actually believe in public and taking actions accordingly.
Well, I think that's one thing you see in my business, which is oil and gas. I mean, you have, of course, your public companies are going to go along with a lot of the environmental policies, and even the independents. I mean, the oil and gas industry is one of the most heavily regulated industries out there. Mm-hmm. But the independents, which find most of the oil here in this country, we are pushing forward. We're still exploring. Yes. We're making discoveries. And in fact, even with all of the turmoil that the government, or all of the pushback that the government's had, we've actually been able to increase production this year, simply because prices obviously have been a lot better. I mean, this administration obviously trying to kill the oil and gas industry has caused oil prices to go higher. And we still have a lot of product out there to find. So, we are pushing back, and we are out there still exploring for oil and gas to, and I think in the end, a lot of these, this push for green energy. I mean, while I'm on board with all forms of energy. I mean, we've got 6.7 billion people in the world, so we need all forms of energy. But oil and gas is not going away anytime in the future.
Right. I do applaud your industry, and I mean, the fracking revolution was amazing, and I mean, it's still going, and it was not, an achievement of big oil. It was an achievement of a lot of, smaller companies, as you say, independents. But the hostility from this government to your industry is mind-boggling. I mean, the first thing that Biden did when he, on day one, when he was inaugurated, was kill the Keystone XL pipeline. Now, which was for some of your listeners who may not remember, it was a pipeline that was supposed to bring crude oil from Canada down to various refineries in the United States. Now, President Obama delayed a decision on the Keystone XL pipeline. I forget for how many years, 8 years or something. He pursued a death by delay strategy. And the market, this was wonderful. The market improvised around him and started building this crude by rail network, a whole network of train stations and tracks in order to move Canadian crude by rail. Okay. So what has the Biden administration just done? It has just proposed to ban the movement of oil and natural gas by rail in this country. It's unbelievable. Or maybe it's just natural gas. I have to check that. But it seems to be, that they're, in other words, what they're pursuing, although they don't use the words that were popularized by the environmental movement, which is keep it in the ground. The idea is if you can't bring your product to market, then you'll never drill it in the first place. And this is just crazy, because without the ability to move natural gas around, and as you know, pipelines are being blocked, time and time again, which is the most efficient way to move gas or oil. So rail then becomes the next alternative. And if you can't move gas around by rail, how are you going to get it to our liquefied natural gas export terminals to send to Europe, so that Europe can't be coerced by Vladimir Putin, who can't threaten them, well, I'll cut off your gas unless you let me run amok, in Ukraine. And so the Biden administration has just, whatever lip service it gives to the idea of energy security, it counts for nothing with these folks.
Right.
Unfortunately.
No, I agree with you. I think that, they push all of these policies and say how pro-energy and how pro the little guy we are, but when it comes down to it, the main person that they're hurting is the little guy, or the, middle class, trying to destroy it. And it's almost laughable, I guess, as far as a lot of the policies they push. And I think the American people are finally starting to see through it. And again, bringing us back to the topic on electric vehicles, I mean, if people don't want to buy them, they should be able to buy gas vehicles, or if they want electric vehicles, obviously they should have a right to buy them. And I think that's why a lot of people are pushing back on it.
Right. I mean, if the electric vehicle is such a great bargain, such a great deal for consumers, why do we need a mandate to make us buy them? I mean, do we do that with any other kind of product? It's crazy. But something that I have a colleague here named Ben Lieberman, and he would make a great guest, because he specializes in the consumer appliance impacts of federal rulemakings. And so one of the things that really brought this to prominence, of course, was the suggestion by the Consumer Product Safety Commission that maybe they'll ban gasoline, natural gas powered ovens and stoves, right? Ranges and so on. And one of the things that Ben points out to me, citing data from the Department of Energy, is that if you're looking at the consumer cost of operating an appliance on gas versus electricity is 3 times more expensive. Yeah. This is what the Biden administration wants us to rely on to run our homes, cook our food, wash our clothes, heat our homes. Now, if someone prefers electric ranges and, electric heating, fine. But why compel Americans to spend 3 times as much if they don't want to?
And isn't it going to cost more to generate that much electricity? I mean, when it comes down to it, you're generating electricity through coal, natural gas, nuclear, wind, and solar. And, of course, I read somewhere, I think the total amount of wind and solar is about 20%. So still 80% of our electricity generation is coming from natural gas and coal, right?
Right. So yeah, sure. So this leads to higher consumer energy costs. And who is that good for? Yeah. Well, it's good for someone who thinks it would be good if more and more of the country would depend on federal government subsidies to survive.
I think you hit
that you can't really get through the day, get through the week without our help. And why would anyone want to put you in that position, make you dependent on them for their help? I leave that to your listeners' imaginations. It's not too hard to figure it out, but I don't want to be accused of attributing bad motives to anyone.
Well, it's kind of like California last year, right? They came out and, during the heat wave and told all their customers that they needed to stop charging their electric vehicles because they were putting too much stress on the grid.
Yes, right. Right. Yeah, so their claim is that the heat waves are caused by climate change. The solution is electric vehicles. But, you can't run your electric vehicle because if you do, it'll crash the grid.
I know that climate change is, that seems to be the new word just about for everything. I mean,
sure.
As far as that, I mean, it's all, I guess, trying to impose on the American people, not only American people, but globally, that, we all have to do our part for climate change. So we need to go back to burning wood and coal as opposed to natural gas and oil.
Right. And of course, there's no safety hazard in burning a fire inside your house, or in, breathing the smoke from the fireplace. And, what they'll argue, or assert rather, I wouldn't call it an argument anymore, is that it's an existential threat. All hands on deck. We only have 12 years. No, wait a minute. Let me recalculate. We now only have 4 years, to save the planet. And that's just poppycock. Global warming is real. I think that it is to a certain degree, a measurable degree even, although I'm not sure that I could prove it, driven by rising greenhouse gas emissions. However, if you look at the big picture, if you look back, let's say, over the last century, we see that the globe, the world as a whole seems to be about 1 degree Celsius warmer than it used to be, and that carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere are, I think, about 1/3 higher than they used to be. But what else happened? The number of people who die annually on a decade by decade, basis, because you can't really look at just 1 year fluctuations. But if you look at decade by decade, the number of people who die from extreme weather events since the 1920s has declined by 96%. And if you consider that the global population has increased by 4 times, it means that the average person's risk of death from extreme weather is 99.7% lower than it was 100 years ago. So where exactly is this climate emergency? If we're experiencing a climate emergency now, how would you describe the climate situation of the 1920s? And why was it that in the 1920s, the roaring 20s, nobody said anything about the weather as being somehow existential or the central concern? I mean, and then if you consider damages, climate-related damages those are going up, but that's because we have a larger, wealthier population all the time. But if you actually make the relevant comparison, which is to how big are climate-related damages, hurricanes, blizzards, floods, in proportion to exposed wealth, exposed GDP, it has decreased. It has declined by nearly 5-fold since the 1980s. So where is the climate emergency in that data? That's those two figures, the relative risk of dying from extreme weather and of having valuable property damaged from extreme weather. Those metrics are moving dramatically in the right direction, and yet somehow we're supposed to believe and not even be allowed to question whether or not we are in the midst of a climate emergency.
Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense. In fact, I think I read somewhere that more people have died from the cold weather as opposed to the heat that they're claiming that obviously the globe is getting warmer, but it's a lot more have perished from the cold than the heat.
Well, yeah, that's exactly true. There's the study that you're referring to, and the lead author's name escapes me now, but I think it came out a few years ago. But he and his co-authors, and there was a lot of them, like 16 or something,
Mm-hmm.
and they attempted to do a global comprehensive study, and they found that something like cold weather kills 20 times as many people as extreme cold kills about 20 times as many people as extreme heat. And one fact that is kind of often overlooked but very important is people vote with their feet on the climate. And as you see, the biggest population shift in the United States is from the colder Rust Belt regions to the warmer Sun Belt. And if you go to a place like Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona, or Tampa, Florida, where hot weather is common, people have adapted to it, and there is almost no heat-related mortality there. And so if hot weather becomes more frequent and more common in the colder regions of the United States, there will be enhanced adaptation in those places as well. In any event, the number of people who die from heat waves in the United States per population has been declining since the 1960s. It doesn't, and it is true that the average weather is warmer, but the alarmists forget that human beings are kind of our leading species characteristic is adaptability, and we figure out ways of organizing our lives, of modifying building stock, of changing the dress, the apparel that we wear, and so on. And that so far, as I said, worldwide, the weather-related mortality risk is just a tiny fraction of what it used to be 100 years ago in the good old days before SUVs and natural gas power plants.
And again, it all comes back to this propaganda that the government is pushing. And, in your opinion, what is the social cost of the government's hostility towards fossil fuels?
Oh, gosh. Well, it's hard to say exactly, how to measure that. I'm very dubious of any kind of quantification of social cost, but because the other side wields it like a big stick to claim that infinitesimal, unmeasurable reductions in global temperature are actually worth billions of dollars because we multiply what we think is the social cost of a ton of carbon dioxide emissions by the number of tons that we reduce, even though scientists won't be able to see any difference in average global temperatures or any other environmental indicator that might be related to average temperature. However, it's obvious that civilization is a gigantic social benefit, that we all are better off if we live in a prosperous country, in a prosperous community, in a safe neighborhood. All of those things enhance our safety, security, and standard of living, and our pursuit of happiness. But the thing is, though, that you can't really have any of that unless you have abundant, affordable, reliable energy. And so I would say that fossil fuels, have contributed more to increase the social benefits of civilization, which is itself a social benefit beyond what precedes civilization. More fossil fuels have contributed more to that than perhaps any other single factor. Certainly more than all the environmental programs put combined.
No, I agree. And, you've worked in government. I mean, do a lot of these politicians that support the Green New Deal actually believe in it?
Well, I I don't interact with many of those folks, and they certainly wouldn't let their guard down in front of me. I mean, I do interact with them occasionally, but not, not in camera, only in public settings. So, I mean, yeah, you never know what. Remember the old radio program, The Shadow? Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows. Well, actually, only an omniscient God could know that. The thing is that what I have found in Washington, D.C. is that very few people are simply cynical. Even the people who know that they are ruthlessly pursuing their own ambition want to believe that somehow there's a greater public good that justifies their selfishness, that there's a higher ideal that makes it okay for them to have special privileges, and for there to be, say, even for there to be a two-tier justice system, because after all, you're trying to save the world or achieve equity or social equity or whatever it is by any means necessary. So there's a lot of that kind of thinking that I've seen. And I actually, when I came here, I was kind of surprised, because I didn't come from a government background. I came from an academic background, and it was a question to me, like, are all these people simply venal, or are they all simply, ideologues? And, people are complicated. And I think the same person can have some of both. And I think the proportions probably change from year to year. I mean, most people like all of us, we're all caught up in the work we do. And very few people, I think, have that kind of interest or leisure to sit back and examine themselves to figure out exactly what is driving them. I mean, how Al Gore has gotten rich, from promoting climate alarms. So do you think do you think Al Gore doesn't know that? Well, of course he knows that, but do you think Al Gore ever has any doubts about his righteousness in so doing? No, I don't think he does either. And it's very easy for people to believe that they are honorable if the ideals that they pursue, reward them. So anyway, it's a complicated question. I'll just say that I've never met anyone who has actually said to me, I think what I'm professing is a load of garbage, but I do it because it makes me electable, or it makes me rich. I've never heard anyone on any side of any debate say anything like that.
Yeah. Well, it just seems to me that, just from listening to the news, obviously I'm not around people in Washington very often, but it seems like everyone has talking points. And once that talking point gets thrown out, then, just about every network kind of mimics it or has their own little turn on it. And, it just seems like there's one group, and that maybe that's the EPA, or maybe that's the environmental socialist governance group that throws out these narratives, and everybody just seems to fall in line and follow along with it.
Yeah, it's really incredible. I would say one of the big challenges of maintaining a free society today is that we really don't, and this is not an original thought with me. I've heard Chris Plant, the radio talk show host, say this frequently. If only we had a real fourth estate, if only we had, a real news industry. We don't anymore. We basically have the merging of state and corporate power in terms of the news industry, by and large. Now there are exceptions, of course. I mean, there are all the talk show hosts you can listen to, and there are people like you who have podcasts, and then there are certain television networks, I think, that strive to present alternative perspectives and really solid information. But yeah, I mean, it is amazing. I mean, especially in terms of the attacks on Republicans and conservatives. once you hear one of these, like, MSNBC or CNN, have a talking point, then you find that it's everywhere, and you wonder who started it, and I actually think it really doesn't matter. It's just like, as I was saying earlier about the collusive arrangements that arise when people are simply acting on the political market signals that are quite evident. They all can see that, oh, okay, this is what we need to be saying today about this topic. And it goes hand in hand with the cancel culture. They all know that their strength, because that's the thing, is that so much of the news media today is hooked on power, just like the politicians with whom they ally. And so they're really not interested in getting at the facts or presenting information that allows the home audience to make its own judgments based on the information, but they want one approved narrative to be the only thing people hear. And so they have a motivation now. No one has to give them their marching orders, although there is some of that, as we know, where the FBI actually went to Facebook, and said, hey, this is how you need to be aware. You need to be aware that something's going to happen here that has all the earmarks of Russian disinformation, so you can't cover it. So there is some coordination, explicit coordination. I think it would be naive to deny that. But I think most of it happens just because they all know they're on the same team, and they all basically have the same objective, which is to grow the state at the expense of the private sector.
Well, that's why I like groups like yours, that you work with, and y'all seem to put out good information and try to tell people the actual truth of what's going on out there, as opposed to the mainstream media. And you tell our listeners how to follow you, Marlo?
Oh, well, thank you very much, Mike. Yes. My organization it's not mine, it's my employer, is the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And our website address is CEI, the letters CEI.org. And then if you go to the top of the page, you can search on the blog, or you can search on the regulatory comments. I do a lot of writing comments on proposed regulations. And then there's a list of authors that comes up, and you just have to scroll down and click on my name, and then you can follow some of the more recent things that I've done.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. I'd love to have you back in the future.
Oh, it